Sign it. I don't have time for mistakes, William Harrington said, his voice calm in the way only men who controlled millions of dollars could afford to be. The words landed inside the glass-walled restaurant high above Manhattan like a final verdict rather than a request, while the city below shimmered with evening lights and in different motion. Inside, everything was polished to perfection. White linen tables, crystal glasses catching the glow of pendant lights, and a silence so expensive it felt manufactured. Maya Carter moved between tables with steady hands, a Black Waitress uniform blending into the rhythm of service, yet her eyes never truly left the table where the real decisions were being made. She wasn't supposed to notice details like signatures or ink pressure or the subtle inconsistency in a document meant to move $200 million between companies, but she did. She always did. William Harrington leaned back slightly, his tailored suit untouched by the tension he created in others, his confidence built from years of closing deals that reshaped entire markets. Across from him, executives nodded too quickly, laughed too carefully, and avoided silence as if it might expose them. Somewhere between the clinking of silverware and the quiet murmur of agreements being finalized, Maya saw it. The signature on the final page of the contract. It looked perfect at first glance, almost too perfect, like something replicated rather than written. Her steps slowed without permission from her schedule. She had seen thousands of documents pass through rooms like this, had memorized patterns she was never supposed to study, and something about this one pulled at her attention like a thread threatening to unravel fabric. She glanced toward the head of the table where William Harrington was already reaching for his pen, his movements precise, practiced, final. No one else hesitated. No one else looked twice. That was the rule in rooms like this. Do your job, stay invisible, and never interrupt power. But Maya's gaze lingered just long enough to recognize what others ignored. The signature belonged to someone who should not have had access to authorize this deal. A name buried in corporate history, a figure legally removed from authority years ago. The realization did not arrive loudly. It settled quietly, like a shift in gravity that only she seemed to feel. William's CFO, Daniel Reed, stood slightly behind the chair, expression carefully neutral, his fingers adjusting his cufflink a fraction too often, a movement so small it would have been invisible to anyone not trained to notice what people did when they were lying to themselves. The air in the room did not change, but something underneath it did. Maya placed a wine glass down gently at the edge of the table, her reflection splitting across its curved surface as she looked once more at the signature, then at the man about to authorize it. And for the first time that evening, the system around her felt less like order and more like something waiting to break. The silence at the table did not break, yet it began to feel heavier, as if the air itself had grown more aware of what was about to happen. William Harrington continued speaking with the ease of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question, his eyes fixed on the contract as though it had already been conquered. Around him, executives leaned in slightly, their attention carefully calibrated to match his authority, while the city outside the glass walls moved in different motion 20 floors below. Maya Carter stood near the edge of the dining space, her presence officially unnoticed, her hands steady as she adjusted the placement of a silver tray, but her focus was no longer on service. It was on a single detail that refused to align with everything she knew about corporate documentation. The signature on the final page was not just unusual, it was structurally inconsistent, as if someone had replicated intention but not origin. She had seen enough administrative processes in her years working in environments like this to understand that mistakes of that scale did not happen by accident. They happened by design. Daniel Reed, the chief financial officer, shifted his weight slightly behind William Harrington, his posture relaxed but not natural, like someone standing inside a moment they had rehearsed too many times. His gaze never stayed in one place for long, always returning to the document, always avoiding the people around him at the exact moments they might have been watching him more closely. Maya noticed that too, not because she was supposed to, but because invisibility had taught her to observe what power assumed would never be examined. William finally reached forward, his hand closing around the pen placed precisely where it needed to be, and in that small motion there was a sense of finality, as if the room itself had already agreed with him. "Once this is signed, we move forward immediately," he said, his tone unchanged, steady as steel, and the words carried a weight that made hesitation feel almost inappropriate in response. No one contradicted him. No one questioned the pace. That was the structure of rooms like this. Certainty was rewarded, doubt was dismissed. Maya's eyes returned to the signature once more, and this time she allowed herself to trace its form in her mind, comparing it to something she had once seen during a short period of administrative training she had taken years earlier, before life redirected her into work that kept her moving instead of studying. The resemblance was not exact, but it was close enough to create discomfort, too close to ignore. A waiter passed behind her, the soft sound of footsteps blending into the ambient music, and for a brief moment the world felt balanced again, as if nothing beneath the surface had changed. But Maya knew better than to trust surfaces. Daniel Reed's phone rested face down near his glass, vibrating once silently, then stopping, as though even communication had learned caution in this environment. William Harrington glanced at the final page, eyes scanning quickly, not for verification but for confirmation of expectation. That was when Maya made a decision that did not belong to her position in the room. She stepped forward just enough for her presence to register at the edge of the table, not interrupting, not yet speaking, but close enough that the rhythm of confidence around William Harrington began to fracture by a fraction of a second. The contract remained open in front of him, pen hovering slightly above paper, as if the final act of authority had paused without permission. And in that pause, something unspoken shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but irreversibly. The moment Maya Carter stepped closer to the table, the atmosphere did not change outwardly, but something subtle shifted beneath the surface of the room, like a quiet recalibration of attention that no one admitted to performing. William Harrington kept his gaze on the contract, but his grip on the pen slowed by a fraction, not enough to be noticed as hesitation, yet enough to suggest the mind behind it had registered something outside its expected rhythm. Daniel Reed remained still, but the angle of his shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly, as if the space behind him had become slightly smaller. Maya did not speak yet. She simply looked at the document again, and this time the inconsistency in the signature felt less like a detail and more like a structure built on unstable ground. She had seen enough administrative documents in her life to understand that authenticity carried patterns, not just appearance. And what lay before her did not follow those patterns. The signature belonged to someone who should not have had authority to authorize anything at this level. Someone whose name had been removed from active corporate governance records nearly 2 years earlier after a public resignation that had been quietly buried in financial news cycles. That fact alone should have made the document invalid. Yet here it was, placed at the center of a $200 million decision. William finally spoke again, his tone still composed, but with a slight impatience forming at the edges. "If there is an issue, I suggest it be raised quickly," he said, not looking up, as though the idea of interruption itself was a procedural inconvenience. Around him, the executives shifted in their seats, their attention carefully divided between curiosity and loyalty to the momentum of the deal. Momentum was important in rooms like this. Momentum was often mistaken for correctness. Maya's voice, when it came, was measured rather than loud, calm rather than disruptive, but it carried a clarity that cut through the controlled rhythm of the table. "This signature does not match the authorization record for this agreement," she said. There was no accusation in her tone, only observation, but observation itself felt out of place in a room built on assumption. A brief silence followed, thinner than before, more fragile. One of the executives gave a short, uncomfortable laugh, as if trying to dismiss the moment before it could develop weight. William slowly set the pen down without signing, his eyes lifting now to meet hers for the first time since she had stepped into his awareness. The shift was immediate, not in volume but in focus, as though the room had narrowed to the space between them. "You are part of the service staff," he said, not as a question, but as a categorization meant to re-establish boundaries. Maya did not react to the statement. She had heard variations of it in different forms for most of her working life. Instead, she continued, her attention anchored to the document. "The signature belongs to a former executive whose access to corporate authorization systems was revoked 18 months ago," she said, the words precise, each one placed with care. The mention of time altered the energy again. Daniel Reed shifted his stance slightly, his eyes flicking toward the document, then away. William's expression did not change immediately, but something behind his gaze tightened, a recognition forming not of error, but of potential disruption. The deal was no longer a straight line. It had acquired friction. Maya finally looked up, not challenging, not pleading, but simply present, and in that presence there was an unspoken awareness that what she had identified could not be unseen once spoken. The room did not yet understand the full shape of what she had noticed, but it had already begun to change how it listened. The words Maya Carter had just spoken did not echo loudly, but they settled into the room with a weight that no one could easily dismiss. For a brief moment, the ambient sound of the restaurant seemed to retreat, as if even the subtle background music had lowered itself in deference to the shift in attention. William Harrington did not respond immediately. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the document, as though staring at it long enough might restore its integrity through force of will alone. Around him, the executives exchanged brief glances, careful not to speak too quickly, as uncertainty in rooms like this was often mistaken for weakness. Daniel Reed finally adjusted his posture again, this time more deliberately, his fingers brushing the edge of his jacket sleeve before resting still. Maya remained where she stood, neither advancing nor retreating, her presence defined not by movement, but by the absence of it. She had already said what she needed to say, yet the silence that followed felt like a question still waiting for permission to exist. William exhaled slowly, placing the pen down fully now, no longer hovering above the contract. When he finally looked at her again, there was a change in his expression that did not yet reach the level of acknowledgement, but no longer resembled dismissal. "You are making a serious claim," he said, his voice controlled, measured, the kind of tone used when shifting a conversation from informal dismissal into formal scrutiny. Maya did not lower her gaze. "I am identifying an inconsistency that affects the validity of the authorization chain," she replied, each word precise, as though she understood that clarity would matter more than persuasion in a room structured around authority. One of the executives leaned slightly forward, attempting to regain control of the moment through explanation. "There must be a misunderstanding," he said quickly, offering a smile that did not fully form. "That signature was verified through internal compliance." Maya turned her eyes briefly toward him, then back to the document. "Verified against what record?" she asked. The question was simple, but it landed with a subtle disruption, because it required specificity in an environment built on assumed agreement. Daniel Reed's hand moved once toward the document, then stopped halfway, as if reconsidering whether even that gesture might draw attention. William finally shifted in his chair, the first physical sign that the conversation had moved beyond inconvenience. He looked at Maya again, not as a member of staff now, but as a variable that had entered an otherwise controlled equation. "Explain your conclusion," he said. It was not permission, but it was acknowledgement that something required structure. Maya stepped slightly closer, not invading space, but closing distance just enough for clarity. "The signature belongs to an executive removed from authorization systems after a compliance termination record dated 18 months ago," she said again. But this time she added, "The metadata on this document does not reflect any system update after that removal." A subtle tension spread across the table, not visible in any single reaction, but present in the collective stillness that followed. William looked down at the contract again, slower this time, as if seeing it through a different layer of understanding. Daniel Reed finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "That record was sealed," he said, almost to himself, though it reached the table. Maya did not react outwardly, but her attention sharpened at the word sealed, because sealed information did not typically appear in active transaction documents unless something had been intentionally bridged between systems that should not have been connected. The room, without realizing it, had stopped treating the contract as final. It had become something else entirely. William Harrington placed one hand lightly on the table, steadying himself not physically, but structurally, as if recalibrating the foundation of the decision in real time. "We will verify this immediately," he said, no longer addressing Maya as interruption, but as catalyst. And for the first time since the meeting began, the certainty that had defined the room no longer felt absolute, but conditional. The atmosphere in the Glass Tower restaurant shifted again as William Harrington lifted his hand slightly, signaling that the verification process should begin without delay. What had once been a celebration of certainty was now transitioning into something far more fragile, a live examination of assumptions that had previously been accepted without resistance. Daniel Reed moved first, stepping a half-pace backward as he retrieved his phone, his expression carefully neutral but no longer relaxed, as though the structure of the room had subtly removed his ability to remain invisible. Maya Carter stayed still, her attention fixed on the contract, but now also on the reactions forming around it, because once authority begins to question itself, it rarely does so quietly. An assistant approached William's side and received a brief instruction spoken low enough that it did not carry beyond their immediate space, and within moments, a secure terminal was being accessed at the far end of the private dining area. The executives who had been confident minutes earlier now sat with restrained posture, each of them aware that verification was not just a procedural step, but a public examination of credibility. William remained composed, yet his gaze no longer rested comfortably on the document alone. It moved between Maya, the contract, and Daniel Reed with increasing frequency, as though recalibrating where responsibility might eventually settle. Maya finally stepped back half a pace, not out of retreat, but to allow the system itself to respond without interference, because she understood that truth in environments like this rarely needed force, only exposure. The terminal operator confirmed secure access to corporate authorization records, and the request for signature validation was initiated. A quiet sequence of digital confirmations followed, displayed on a discrete screen angled away from casual view, but still visible enough for those directly involved. At first, the information appeared consistent with standard protocol, reinforcing the expectation that nothing unusual would surface. But then a secondary verification layer triggered, one that was not part of the standard approval workflow. Daniel Reed noticed it first. His eyes narrowed slightly as he leaned forward, focusing on a line of metadata that should not have been present in an active financial document. William's expression changed subtly, not dramatically, but with a controlled tightening around the eyes that indicated recognition of discrepancy rather than surprise. The system displayed a historical override flag, tied to the signature in question, and alongside it, a dormant authorization link that should have been permanently severed according to corporate compliance records. Maya observed the shift in silence, not reacting to the data itself, but to the reaction it produced, because systems did not usually contradict themselves unless something had been intentionally preserved beneath official revision layers. Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower now, less composed than before. "That connection should not exist," he said, more to the screen than to anyone in particular. William did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied the information with increasing focus, as if reconstructing the sequence of decisions that could have allowed such a breach to remain hidden. The room no longer felt like a place of execution for a deal, but like a space where assumptions were being carefully dismantled one layer at a time. Maya's attention remained steady, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same measured clarity as before. "If the authorization chain was modified after removal, then this document is not an agreement," she said, pausing briefly before continuing. "It is a reconstruction." The words settled across the table with unusual weight, because reconstruction implied intent, not error. William slowly leaned back in his chair, no longer anchored to the forward motion of the deal, and for the first time, the confidence that had defined his presence in the room gave way to something quieter, more analytical, and far more uncertain. The verification results remained on the screen longer than anyone in the room was comfortable with, not because the information was complex, but because it refused to resolve into a simple explanation. What had begun as a routine validation had now become a layered audit of history, permissions, and overwritten authorization pathways that no one at the table had anticipated encountering in real time. William Harrington remained seated, but his posture had shifted subtly, his shoulders no longer carrying the ease of control that had defined him at the start of the meeting. Instead, there was a measured stillness, the kind that forms when a person is actively reorganizing their understanding of what they thought they already knew. Daniel Reed stood closer to the display now, His attention locked on a sequence of system logs that showed temporal inconsistencies in the signature's activation history. The data did not suggest a simple error. It suggested continuity where continuity should not have existed. Maya Carter observed without moving forward again, her role in the room no longer perceived as service but as origin point of disruption. She had not raised her voice, had not altered the tone of the environment, yet everything around her had shifted in response to what she identified. William finally spoke, his voice lower than before, carrying a controlled restraint that was no longer rooted in confidence, but in calculation. "Explain how this level of access could persist after removal," he said, not directed at anyone in particular, but clearly anchored to the system itself. The technician at the terminal hesitated before responding, navigating through additional verification layers that now required escalation approval. "There appears to be a residual authorization thread embedded within a legacy administrative mirror system," the technician said carefully, as though each word needed to be weighed before release. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. "That should have been decommissioned during the compliance restructuring cycle," he said, his voice now carrying the faintest edge of concern. Maya's gaze remained steady, not on the screen anymore, but on the reaction forming in the room, because systems did not only fail through technical error, they failed through selective oversight, and selective oversight always had a source. William leaned forward slightly again, his eyes narrowing as he reviewed the metadata timeline himself. "Who initiated the original signature request?" he asked. The question shifted the entire structure of attention in the room, because it redirected focus from the document to intent. Daniel did not answer immediately, and in that silence the absence of explanation became more revealing than any data point on the screen. Maya finally spoke again, her tone unchanged, precise and calm. "If the authorization originated after the individual's removal, then it was not validated through standard governance channels," she said. "It was routed through a bypass structure." The phrase bypass structure caused a subtle reaction across the table, because it implied not malfunction but design. William looked at her now with a different kind of focus, one that no longer dismissed her presence as incidental. "And you identified this without access to internal systems," he said. It was not skepticism anymore. It was inquiry. Maya nodded once. "Because the inconsistency was visible in the signature alignment and timing sequence," she replied. The technician's screen refreshed again, and a new layer of audit logs appeared, revealing a sequence of approval timestamps that did not correspond with any authorized executive session. Daniel stepped back slightly, his silence now deliberate rather than observational. William's hand rested lightly on the edge of the table, no longer as an anchor of authority, but as an attempt to maintain composure while the structure of the deal continued to shift beneath him. The room no longer felt like it belonged to certainty. It belonged to discovery, and discovery had already begun to move in a direction none of them had planned for. The room remained suspended in a state that no one at the table had anticipated when the meeting began, as the verification system continued to process layers of historical authorization data that were now unfolding in real time across the discrete display at the far end of the dining space. William Harrington no longer looked at the contract itself. His attention had shifted entirely to the chain of audit logs, each line revealing decisions that had once been sealed away from active operational visibility. The presence of those records suggested not just an inconsistency, but a deliberate continuity of access that defied the expected structure of corporate governance. Daniel Reed stood motionless now, his earlier composure replaced by a controlled stillness that suggested calculation rather than reaction, as if he were mentally tracing every possible point of exposure that might connect back to him. Maya Carter remained where she had stopped, her posture unchanged, but the effect of her presence in the room had evolved. She was no longer being treated as an observer or service staff. She had become the reference point through which the entire system was being reinterpreted. The technician at the terminal adjusted the display again, revealing a deeper authorization layer embedded beneath the primary records, one that indicated routing through an auxiliary administrative pathway that should have been permanently disabled following compliance restructuring 18 months earlier. William finally spoke, his voice measured but no longer anchored in certainty. "Why was a legacy pathway still active in a live financial authorization chain?" he asked, not directed at the technician alone, but at the structure itself. The technician hesitated before responding, scanning through secondary validation nodes. The system indicates residual dependency inheritance from pre-restructure executive access protocols, he said carefully, as though the phrasing itself required caution. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of inheritance, his attention shifting toward the timeline metadata again. That system was supposed to be fully isolated, he said, his voice quieter now, less declarative than before. Maya's gaze remained steady, but her focus sharpened on the implication beneath the data. Isolation in systems like this did not always mean removal. Sometimes it meant concealment within parallel architecture that remained technically dormant until reactivated by specific conditions. William leaned forward again, studying the screen with increasing intensity. Who has the ability to reactivate a dormant authorization structure? He asked. The technician paused, then responded with controlled precision. Only individuals with historical administrative clearance tied to executive override privileges. The words altered the tone of the room again, because they introduced not error, but agency. Daniel exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, and shifted his gaze away from the screen for the first time in several minutes. William noticed that shift. Maya noticed it as well. The contract remained open on the table, but it no longer represented a final agreement. It had become evidence of something layered beneath its surface, something that had used legitimacy as a cover for procedural manipulation. William slowly straightened in his chair, his expression now fully engaged in reassessment. Run a full trace on initiation origin, he said. The technician complied immediately, and the display refreshed again, this time revealing a branching sequence of access points that converged on a single administrative node. The node was labeled under a neutral system identifier, but the timestamp pattern indicated repeated activation cycles that aligned with recent transaction approvals. Daniel took a half step back without realizing it, his hands briefly resting on the back of the chair in front of him, as if grounding himself in physical stability while the digital structure beneath him became increasingly unstable. Maya did not move, but her attention was now fully aligned with the convergence point on the screen. William's eyes remained fixed on the final line of the trace as it completed its resolution. The room did not speak. It waited. And in that waiting, the structure of authority that had defined the meeting began to lose its assumed permanence. The convergence trace on the screen completed its final sequence, and what appeared next did not immediately register as dramatic, but as structural confirmation that something in the system had been intentionally routed through a path that bypassed standard authorization governance. The identifier displayed at the center of the audit chain was not unfamiliar in isolation, but its context within the live financial approval flow made it impossible to interpret as coincidence. William Harrington stared at the display for several seconds without speaking, his focus narrowing as the implication of the system architecture became clearer with each passing line of metadata. Daniel Reed did not move, but the tension in his posture had shifted again, now more contained, as if he were actively calculating distance between himself and the unfolding verification results rather than observing them as a participant. Maya Carter remained steady at the edge of the table, her presence unchanged, but the impact of her earlier observation had now fully transformed the direction of the room's attention. She was no longer the person who noticed an inconsistency. She was the reason the inconsistency had been fully exposed. The technician highlighted the final node in the authorization chain, and the display expanded automatically, revealing a historical access correlation map that connected multiple approval layers across different time intervals. Each connection pointed back to a central administrative authority that had executed repeated overrides under conditions that should have triggered compliance alerts. William finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before, no longer carrying the same controlled confidence that had defined his earlier tone. This level of routing should have been permanently disabled after restructuring, he said, not as a statement of accusation, but as an acknowledgement of systemic contradiction. The technician responded carefully, choosing words that reflected the sensitivity of the data now exposed. The system indicates that the override authority was preserved under legacy executive continuity permissions, he said. The phrase executive continuity permissions changed the atmosphere in the room, because it implied not accidental failure, but sustained authorization that had survived organizational change. Daniel's eyes shifted briefly toward William, then away again, as though avoiding alignment with any interpretation that might be drawn too directly from the data. Maya's gaze remained fixed on the convergence point of the trace, where multiple branches of approval had been funneled into a single origin layer. That origin layer, now fully visible, carried a timestamp sequence that indicated repeated activation cycles coinciding with high-value transaction approvals over the past several months. William leaned slightly forward again, his expression now fully engaged in analytical reconstruction rather than decision-making. "Isolate the initiating credential," he said. The technician complied, and the screen refreshed once more, removing secondary noise layers and focusing on a single administrative identity marker. The marker was not labeled in a way that suggested external breach or unauthorized intrusion. Instead, it was embedded within a category reserved for trusted executive oversight functions, which made the implications significantly more complex. Daniel exhaled slowly, almost inaudibly, and adjusted his stance again, this time stepping slightly away from the table edge, as if increasing physical distance might reduce conceptual exposure. William did not look at him, but his awareness of the shift was evident in the pause that followed. Maya remained composed, her attention now fully aligned with the final resolution of the trace. The system had not failed randomly. It had followed permission structures that were still technically valid within outdated but active governance layers. The contract on the table, still open and unsigned, now existed in a different context entirely. It was no longer just a financial agreement. It was a record of how authority could persist beyond the structures meant to contain it. And in that realization, the room itself seemed to recalibrate what it thought it was witnessing. The display on the secure terminal refreshed once more, but this time the system did not present additional branches or layered metadata. Instead, it consolidated the entire authorization sequence into a single reconstructed timeline, as if it had reached a point where further segmentation was no longer possible. William Harrington remained silent as he read the sequence from top to bottom, his eyes moving more slowly now, absorbing not just the data, but the implication of continuity across multiple approval cycles that had previously been invisible within standard reporting structures. Daniel Reed stood at a fixed distance from the table, no longer attempting to engage with the screen directly, his posture suggesting a deliberate withdrawal from interpretive responsibility. Maya Carter observed the shift in silence, her focus now on the final identification field that the system had isolated after the trace completion. The initiating credential was no longer fragmented across nodes. It was presented as a singular administrative source, linked through repeated override patterns that bypassed conventional compliance checkpoints. The identifier was not marked as external or unauthorized. It was embedded within an internal executive continuity classification that should have required dual approval verification at every activation point. William finally spoke, his voice controlled but noticeably lower than before. "Confirm the ownership status of that credential," he said. The technician hesitated briefly, then executed a secondary validation request. The system processed the query, and the result appeared with minimal delay, suggesting that the data was not being retrieved from archival storage but from active operational memory. Daniel's gaze shifted toward the screen again, but only for a moment, as if confirming what he already suspected. Maya did not move. She had already followed the pattern far enough to understand that the issue was not simply who had signed the document, but how the system had allowed continuity of authority without visible renewal or review. The technician cleared his throat slightly before reading the result. "The credential is registered under Executive Continuity Authority associated with Legacy Governance Access retained post-restructuring cycle," he said carefully. The phrase hung in the air without immediate response. William's expression changed subtly, not into shock, but into recognition of structural vulnerability. The system had not been breached externally. It had functioned exactly as it was permitted to function under outdated but still active permissions. Daniel finally spoke again, his tone lower, more controlled than before. "That continuity layer was supposed to be decommissioned during the executive transition audit," he said, more as a statement of procedural expectation than accusation. Maya's attention remained fixed on the classification label displayed beside the credential chain. The architecture was clear now. Authority had not been stolen. It had been preserved in a form that allowed it to operate beyond visible governance oversight. William leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes no longer scanning for errors, but for intent. "Then this is not a corrupted agreement," he said slowly. "This is an authorized execution under an unmonitored governance layer." The room did not respond immediately, because the implication of that statement extended beyond the contract itself. It suggested that decisions believed to be finalized could still be influenced by structures no longer actively supervised. Daniel's hand moved briefly toward the edge of the table again, then stopped, as if physical contact with the environment might anchor him against the conceptual instability forming around the data. Maya remained steady, her role now fully transformed from observer to catalyst of disclosure. The contract lay unchanged in front of them, but its meaning had shifted entirely. It was no longer a simple transaction. It had become evidence of a system that still remembered authority in places it was assumed to have forgotten. The confirmation from the system terminal settled into the room with a kind of finality that was no longer about interpretation, but about acceptance of structural reality. William Harrington remained seated, his attention fixed on the reconstructed authorization layer that now defined the full scope of what had previously been assumed to be a standard financial agreement. The clarity of the system output removed any remaining ambiguity. This was not an external breach, nor an accidental misconfiguration. It was the continuation of a governance mechanism that had been preserved beneath administrative visibility, operating through legacy continuity permissions that had never been fully terminated. Daniel Reed stood near the edge of the table, his silence now carrying a different weight, less defensive and more contained, as if he understood that speaking further would only accelerate exposure rather than contain it. Maya Carter observed the shift in the room without changing her position. She was no longer simply the person who identified an inconsistency. She had become the point of origin for a chain of discovery that none of the others could now reverse. William slowly reached toward the contract again, but did not touch it. Instead, his hand stopped just above the document, as if physical contact might prematurely finalize something that was still actively unfolding in the system behind it. "If this authorization layer remains active," he said finally, his voice measured but no longer absolute, "then every agreement routed through it carries conditional governance interference." The statement reframed the entire situation, not as a single compromise deal, but as a structural dependency that could extend across multiple transactions. The technician at the terminal continued scanning secondary validation logs, his focus shifting between system timestamps and access hierarchy maps that now showed repeated activation patterns over time. Daniel finally spoke again, more cautiously than before. "We are looking at a continuity framework that was never meant to interface with live transactional processing," he said. The phrasing reflected not discovery, but recognition, as though the existence of the system had been known in abstract terms, but never encountered in operational reality. Maya's gaze remained steady on the display, where the final resolved node indicated persistent authorization linkage across multiple approval cycles. She understood now that the issue was not limited to a single contract or a single signature. It was a mechanism that allowed decisions to be validated through authority that no longer officially existed in active governance charts. William leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, his expression now fully removed from certainty. "Who maintains oversight of this continuity framework now?" he asked, not expecting a simple answer, but requiring confirmation of responsibility. The technician paused, then responded carefully. "The system indicates no active supervisory owner within current executive structure," he said. The absence of ownership created a silence that extended beyond the table. Daniel looked away from the screen entirely, his attention shifting toward the room itself, as if recalibrating his understanding of where control actually resided. Maya finally lowered her gaze to the contract, not because it had changed physically, but because its meaning had shifted entirely. It was no longer a document awaiting approval. It was evidence of an operational architecture that still carried the imprint of past authority into present execution. William's hand withdrew from above the table, and for the first time since the meeting began, he did not attempt to reassert control over the process. Instead, he remained still, as the realization settled that what they were witnessing was not an isolated anomaly, but a system that had been quietly continuing without acknowledgement, waiting to be seen. The absence of an assigned supervisory owner for the continuity framework did not resolve into clarity for anyone at the table, but instead created a deeper and more uncomfortable form of uncertainty, because systems of this scale were never designed to function without identifiable accountability. William Harrington remained still, his gaze fixed on the terminal display as though extended observation might reveal a hidden layer that had not yet been rendered visible. The contract on the table remained physically unchanged, yet its symbolic weight had shifted again, now representing not a single agreement, but a potential gateway through which unauthorized governance logic had been allowed to persist. Daniel Reed stood slightly apart from the table, his posture composed but no longer aligned with the decision-making center of the room, as if he had unconsciously repositioned himself outside of the chain of implication forming around the data. Maya Carter continued to observe without moving closer or stepping back, her presence now functioning less as participation and more as confirmation of what the system itself was revealing. The technician at the terminal initiated another diagnostic layer, expanding the audit sequence into deeper historical logs that extended beyond the initial authorization trace. What appeared on the screen next was not a continuation of error, but a pattern of repeated activation events tied to the same continuity framework across multiple transaction cycles that span months of operational activity. Each activation carried validation markers that suggested approval through legitimate executive channels, yet none of those approvals corresponded with currently active governance records. William finally broke the silence again, his voice controlled but noticeably lower in tone than earlier in the meeting. "How many transactions have passed through this framework in the last fiscal quarter?" he asked. The technician reviewed the expanded dataset, his eyes scanning through sequential timestamps and authorization tags that now formed a continuous chain rather than isolated incidents. The system identifies 7 major financial agreements and multiple secondary vendor authorizations processed through the same continuity layer within the last 90 days, he replied. The number introduced a new dimension to the situation because it transformed the issue from isolated irregularity into systemic pattern. Daniel's expression tightened slightly, not in visible reaction but in internal calculation, as though he was attempting to determine whether the scale of exposure extended beyond what had been revealed. Maya's focus remained steady on the correlation map, now displayed across the screen, where each transaction node connected back to the same dormant administrative authority layer. William leaned forward again, his attention narrowing. "Are all of those transactions currently active?" he asked. The technician hesitated briefly before responding. 3 remain in active fulfillment status under current operational execution, he said. The implication of ongoing activity changed the atmosphere in the room once more, because it meant the system was not referencing historical error but ongoing influence. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, carefully measured. "If active fulfillment is tied to that framework, then any intervention now would require system-level rollback authorization," he said. The phrase introduced procedural complexity that extended beyond the room, beyond the contract, and into the operational integrity of multiple active agreements. Maya's eyes remained on the convergence of data points, where continuity threads intersected with live execution markers. She understood now that what she had identified was not a single anomaly requiring correction, but a living dependency embedded within financial architecture that had been assumed stable. William slowly leaned back, his expression no longer focused on resolution, but on scope. "Then we are not dealing with a single contract," he said quietly, more to himself than to the room. "We are dealing with an entire layer of decision-making that has been operating without visible oversight." The silence that followed was no longer procedural. It was recognition. And within that recognition, the structure of authority in the room continued to shift, no longer anchored to assumption, but to the realization that control had never been as centralized as it appeared. The realization that multiple active financial agreements were still being processed through a dormant continuity framework settled over the room with a weight that no longer resembled uncertainty, but structural implication. William Harrington remained seated, his attention no longer shifting between the contract and the terminal, but fully absorbed by the scope of what the system had revealed. The idea that decision-making authority had been distributed across an unseen layer of governance altered the meaning of everything previously considered finalized within the transaction. Daniel Reed stood motionless near the edge of the table, his earlier attempts at analytical detachment now replaced by a quieter focus, as though he was recalculating the boundaries of responsibility within his own role. Maya Carter maintained her position without movement, her presence steady, but now functioning as the central reference point through which the entire unfolding system was being understood. The technician continued navigating through deeper audit layers, revealing a structured dependency map that extended beyond the visible corporate hierarchy and into archived executive continuity permissions that had never been fully retired from operational memory. William finally spoke again, his voice measured, but carrying a reduced sense of certainty. If these transactions are still active under that framework, then termination of authority is not a historical event, he said slowly. It is an ongoing condition. The phrasing reframed the situation entirely because it removed the concept of completion from governance and replaced it with persistence. Daniel shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he considered the implications. That would mean every approval routed through that system remains subject to retroactive influence, he said, not as speculation, but as deduction. The technician confirmed the continuity behavior with a brief nod, highlighting that system dependencies remain live until explicitly deactivated through a higher-tier override protocol that had not been executed during restructuring. Maya's attention remained fixed on the correlation matrix displayed across the terminal, where financial transactions, approval nodes, and legacy authorization layers converged into a single continuous network. She understood now that the issue was not isolated manipulation, but structural inheritance embedded within institutional design. William leaned forward slightly, his hands resting near the edge of the table, no longer as a gesture of control, but as an attempt to stabilize his focus. Identify all current exposures tied to this framework, he said. The technician executed the command, and the system responded with a progressive expansion of linked transaction data. Each entry revealed a dependency chain that extended across departments, timelines, and financial instruments, all anchored to the same continuity structure that had been assumed inactive. Daniel's expression tightened again as he processed the scale of interconnection being displayed. This is not limited to this agreement, he said quietly, almost to himself. This extends across multiple operational divisions. The statement did not introduce new information so much as confirm the breadth of what was already emerging. Maya finally spoke again, her tone unchanged, precise, and controlled. The system preserved authority continuity as a redundancy mechanism, she said. But redundancy has become execution dependency. The distinction reframed the entire architecture because redundancy was meant to protect systems, not govern them. William remained silent for several seconds, absorbing the implication that what had been designed as a safeguard had evolved into an active governing layer. The contract still lay open on the table, untouched, but its relevance had diminished in proportion to the expanding realization that it was only one visible fragment of a far larger operational structure. The room itself seemed to adjust to this understanding, as if every assumption that had defined authority within it was being quietly rewritten by the evidence now displayed in front of them. The room had reached a point where silence no longer functioned as absence of sound, but as confirmation of understanding that had not yet been verbalized. William Harrington remained seated, his posture unchanged, yet his attention had shifted entirely from the physical contract to the broader system architecture that now defined its existence. What had once been a negotiation had transformed into an exposure of structural governance continuity that extended beyond any single transaction. Daniel Reed stood slightly apart from the table, no longer attempting to interpret outcomes, but instead appearing to accept that interpretation itself had become secondary to system validation. Maya Carter maintained her position, steady and unchanged, her presence now functioning as the origin point of recognition for everything the system had revealed. The technician at the terminal executed the final system consolidation command, collapsing all active audit layers into a unified governance map. The display transitioned slowly, revealing a full continuity structure that connected all previously identified authorization threads into a single integrated framework. William finally spoke, his voice quiet, controlled, but no longer anchored in certainty. This framework was never dormant, he said slowly. It was continuously operating under assumed administrative invisibility. The statement did not provoke reaction because it did not introduce surprise. It confirmed realization. Daniel exhaled quietly, his gaze fixed on the consolidated map. Then every transaction processed through this system was not an isolated decision, he said, but part of a continuous governance execution cycle. The technician confirmed the statement with a brief nod, indicating that system behavior aligned with uninterrupted continuity processing under legacy authorization inheritance. Maya's eyes remained on the central node of the system, where all previously separate approval paths now converged into a single operational origin layer. She understood now that the structure was not designed to fail. It was designed to persist beyond visibility thresholds. William leaned forward slightly, placing both hands near the edge of the table, as if grounding himself within a reality that had shifted away from its initial assumptions. If authority is continuous rather than discrete, he said, then the concept of final approval does not exist in this system. The implications settled across the room without interruption. Daniel remained silent for a moment longer, then spoke carefully. That would mean every executive decision is subject to retrospective continuity influence, he said. The technician confirmed that historical authorization nodes remained active within operational memory and could propagate validation influence across dependent transactions until explicitly terminated through a high-level system override that had never been executed. Maya finally spoke again, her tone unchanged, precise, and steady. Then what we are observing is not a malfunction, she said, but an unrecognized operating model. The distinction reframed everything again, because it removed the assumption of error entirely and replaced it with the existence of an alternative governance logic functioning beneath visible control layers. Williams sat back slowly, his expression no longer focused on resolution, but on comprehension of scale. The contract still lay open on the table, untouched, but it no longer represented the center of the situation. It had become one visible artifact within a much larger system that had continued operating beyond the boundaries of assumed oversight. The room remained still, not because there was nothing left to say, but because every assumption that had once defined authority, decision, and control had already been rewritten by what the system itself had revealed.